Let's start our panel. I would like to invite our distinguished guests. I'm going to start with Her Excellency, Ms. Barbara Creasy, Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, South Africa, Your Excellency. Ambassador Ahmed Abdel Latif, the Director General of the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution. Ms. Amy Pop, Deputy Director General for Management and Reform at the IOM. And Mrs. Estherine Fatabong, Director, Program, Innovation and Planning at NEPAD. Ms. Barbara Rambosik, Director, Gender and Economic Inclusion at the EBRD. And via Zoom, we'll be joined by Vivek Pathak. He's the Director and Global Head for Climate Business at IFC. Is he with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I'm really happy and pleased to be part of this event again and to return to Cairo. My name is Lubna Bouza. I'm the head of business and news at Sky News Arabia, and I will be moderating this workshop. We will be focusing on the impact of climate change or the green transition on the labor market. And I think the minute we mention green economy and so on, the first thing that comes to mind is what would be the impact or the potential jobs loss, especially at a time where the whole world is going through a crisis, some say never seen before. So I'm going to start first by turning to Her Excellency Barbara, and maybe she can run us through the just transition agenda of South Africa, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody present, and allow me to acknowledge our fellow panelists on this interesting topic this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa falls into what John Kerry yesterday afternoon referred to as the top 20 countries that contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions. And I believe that our contribution is something in the order of about 2% to global emissions. 90% of our energy is at the moment generated from coal-fired power stations, and we have a number of industries that are at risk, at transition risk, as the globe moves to greener forms of production that would include our steel industry, our cement industry, and of course our auto industry. And at present there are about 80,000 direct jobs in the coal value chain, and we are in the process of developing a transition pathways in the 7 sectors of our economy that would contribute the most to greenhouse gases. Last year, President Ramaphosa formed the Presidential Climate Commission, and this commission represents business, government, organized labor, and civil society. And it was set up with the knowledge that the climate transition is not just something that affects government. It requires a whole of society transition. And if one is to make sure that there is justice in that transition, the transition needs to be participated in by all sections of society. So the first task of the Climate Commission was to develop a just transition framework. And I can share with you that that process has been completed, and that framework was adopted by the South African government at a cabinet meeting last week. Now, the framework was developed in a participatory manner. It involved workshops across the country with sectors most affected by the climate transition. And in the course of those workshops, 3 issues pertaining to climate justice were raised. The first is that communities most affected by climate change and organized labor said that they want to be part of the process that decides what must happen. And they regard the issue of participatory justice as very central to any transition. The second issue that they raised was that there has to be an equal spreading of both risk and benefit of the transition between those communities and business that would be involved in the transition. And lastly, you would understand that South Africa is a country characterized by inequality, poverty, and unemployment. The view was very strongly that the transition to a green economy has to help us with the underlying problems of economic exclusion, unemployment, and poverty. So, in terms of activities identified in that process, the first was the question of making sure that we have active labor markets that are understanding what the need in future is going to be for skills, for jobs which we don't yet understand what they're going to be. The second was to start to work out career pathways for young people entering into the basic education system and the higher education system. What kinds of skill sets will those young people need in order to be involved in jobs of the future? And lastly, the question that was raised is how are we going to reskill those who are currently in the coal value chain and in other vulnerable sectors of the economy so that they can participate in the jobs of the future. There was recognition that not all workers and not all vulnerable communities may have access to job and economic opportunities equally. And therefore, one of the questions that was raised was the centrality of social support as the transition occurs. And lastly, because of the unequal nature of access to economic opportunities, communities and organized labor were saying that as we develop these new economies, it will be very important to make sure that we have new forms of economic ownership and new forms of economic inclusion. 2 last points. If you're engaging in a transition as wide-ranging as this, one needs to make sure that there are proper governance arrangements. And these governance arrangements have to make sure that the kind of activities that national government would be involved in with regard to reskilling and skilling of organized labor would also be programs that would find their way regionally and also to subnational government. And finally, of course, there's the vexed issue of financing. I think what everybody understands is that South Africa is one of many African countries that is heavily indebted. Most of the finance that is available for climate transitions comes in the form of loan financing. Loan financing requires revenue streams in order to make sure that it's repaid and doesn't add to indebtedness. And therefore, there is also a need, as we look at financing for developing countries, to look at the grant finance options, because not all forms of reskilling and labor market interventions are going to have revenue streams for repayment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've mentioned so many challenges and risks. I'm going to turn to Miss Amy.
Can't hear you.
You cannot? Okay. Miss Amy, as Her Excellency mentioned, she listed a long list, to be quite honest, of challenges faced by the labor market in terms of skills, training, the transition. Will workers have access to maybe fair opportunities and chances? In advanced economies, there is an analysis for the IMF that shows that the transition in emerging markets might be tougher for a very simple reason, that jobs, or most of jobs at the emerging markets, are probably not as the advanced economies neutral. So they're neither green totally all or intensive, pollution intensive. So that's why the transition in emerging markets might be tougher. And my question to you, how important it is to craft labor market policies that are right to shift the balance towards greener jobs, taking in consideration skilling those workers, giving them fair opportunities, so we can do a smooth transition and ease the pain.
Thank you for the question, and thank you to our hosts for having this very, very important conversation, and to my fellow panelists. So needless to say, it's extremely important. But we kind of see it on three different levels, right? We're at the International Organization for Migration, and we're the UN agency that works across basically the triple nexus. We're doing humanitarian response, we're doing development, and we're doing peace building, in order to both mitigate the challenges of migration, but also harness the opportunities. And this is a place where we see a tremendous number of opportunities if we do the kind of planning that we're talking about today. So if we start with where we sit in bringing solutions to the challenge, IOM looks at the issue sort of from three different lenses. One is, what are the solutions for people who will move in the future, right? Two, what are the solutions for people who are already on the move? And three, what are the solutions that enable people to stay in the face of a changing climate? When we look at the first, the solutions for people to move, this is really looking globally. What are the opportunities of the future? We know that migration is going to be essential to help address some of the labor gaps that are going to exist across the world. So whether it is communities that are now aging and will need more labor, whether it's in the healthcare sector, whether it's in other skilled or unskilled areas of work, we need to be training our communities so that they can help provide solutions to communities globally. So thinking more broadly than just within the region. Then there are the questions about what can we be doing for people who are already on the move. And this is really more in the humanitarian space. So if we think, for example, look at a country like South Sudan, where people have already been displaced because of conflict, and then are increasingly displaced because of flooding. Our goal should be to enable those communities who have been displaced because of flooding to use the tools to not exacerbate the problem. So we don't want a situation where a community goes in, cuts down the trees so that they can build new shelter, so they have fuel, and thereby makes their situation more precarious, right? So what are the tools that we can do for those who are in the most immediate need? And finally, the solutions for people to stay. And this is really about within communities. We know already, if we look at the climate indicators, we know that traditional means of farming are just not going to be available. So now is the time to develop the skills so that people will have alternatives. So some of that is going to be very technical, right? It's ensuring that there are technicians who are able to install or repair solar panels, for example. But it also could be ensuring that we are building from early education, vocational, but also higher skilled markets so that they can respond to what will be a global need. So we see that it's incredibly important to focus on all three areas if we're going to be able to comprehensively tackle the problem.
But do you see us on the right track to do all that?
There's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I mean, really, this is an early conversation, and it needs to be far more advanced.
What would be your priority now?
My number one priority is to put the question of human mobility into the discussion on climate change, right? It's happening around the world, but even in the context of COP27, as we're going into this moment in time, to make the question of how do we enable communities to adapt, one of the key areas that globally we agree must be addressed.
Ambassador Ahmed, how can we enable communities to adapt?
Thank you. First, honored to be part of such a distinguished panel. Let me start by saying, I think Her Excellency the Minister talked about South Africa, I think, which is an advanced economy in Africa and has its own transition pathway and all the challenges associated with that. But as we heard also from the conference, other countries have other trajectories and other pathways. And I want to focus in particular, and I'll come to your question, on conflict-affected and fragile countries. And why should we focus on these countries? Well, because the greatest number of conflict and fragile countries are in Africa. And at the same time, they're the most vulnerable to climate change.
So you think there's a specific challenges for those countries? They're different from others?
Yes, if we are talking about a green economy transition for these countries, it's very different than talking from other countries. And why? And I'll speak about the challenges and then one or two of the solutions. Just mention why is Egypt interested. I mean, many of you know as Egypt is a climate champion of the climate cause, but Egypt also is a champion of peace building and post-conflict reconstruction and development in Africa. We're hosting an AU center on this. And we have a platform called the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development that is focused on these countries. And we just had the third edition last June, which focused on climate change and the challenges facing these countries with the participation of many partners, including IOM, who's been a strong partner of this forum. The challenges, including at the community level, are humongous for these countries. If we look at South Sudan, you have a combination of conflict, humanitarian crisis, and climate impacts. 1/3 of the country is under flooding. 20% of the population is displaced. Highest number of refugees in the world. But if you look at other parts of Africa, in the Sahel, 10 million people facing hunger, 20 million in the Horn of Africa. At the same time, a country like South Sudan receives $1.5 billion in humanitarian assistance. So the landscape of these challenges, if we're talking about a green economy transition, for these countries, the trajectory, the pathway is very different from other countries and for the communities there. So for these countries, the critical challenge is resilience and combining that with adaptation to these challenges through building the institutions, the capacities that can address the needs of these communities, and also empowering these communities, the women and youth in particular, through economic opportunity and the private sector, through access to finance. Also, these conflict-affected countries receive even less finance than Africa in general. If Africa receives 5% of climate finance, the conflict and fragile affected countries receive even less finance. Which sectors are relevant for these countries? Again, different a bit from the examples we heard. Agriculture. Agriculture is the biggest sector in many of these countries. So we're looking at ensuring the skills, the smart agriculture development we want to see. And energy, access to energy that we have seen also talked about at the conference. 570 million Africans do not have access to energy. Many of them live off-grid in communities. And there's still a huge work to be done to provide these communities with off-grid access. I want to cite a particular example about solutions, and it's an NGO that started in Nigeria called Solar Sisters, and we had it at our forum. And Solar Sisters about women empowering other women in the communities with decentralized solar energy, and who has reached around 2 million people through their work done through the microfinance and through the support and lifting up these people. So these are just a few examples of, in these set of countries, we face very different challenges of green transition, of labor markets, of skills, compared to other countries, compared to South Africa. So I just wanted to put a spotlight on these countries because our center, also as the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution and Peace Building, we're the secretariat of this forum who works and tries to support these countries through some of these solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Esther, in your capacity, you do a lot of projects to support the communities. Tell us about the one critical challenge that you face in deciding on those.
Thank you, and let me just recognize this distinguished panel and thank the government of Egypt for hosting the second international platform. Africa, we have 11 million young people, joining the labor market every year.
Yep.
And we only produce about 3.7 million jobs. So there is a huge gap of needs. The question is, we are talking about green transition, and we already have a gap in the job market. The core of the development challenge, and I will say, I'm not a politician, but I will say for most politicians, the issue of unemployment is a major, major, major headache for politicians, but for the development of African economies. While we look at the challenges of climate change, and we heard them yesterday, the session on food systems, and the panelists have already mentioned some of them, there are also opportunities, right? Where, as we are talking about just transition, and we're looking at how we transition our economies from sectors that are heavy on emissions, we want to do this in a manner that is fair to the communities and that provide opportunities for young people. The question that we ask ourselves as we go down to the field as AUD and NEPAD is, do we know where these jobs in the future are coming from? And without even going to the future, the jobs now, because as I just mentioned, we are only producing 3.7 million jobs, and we have 11 million young people getting into the job markets. The minister mentioned the number of people in South Africa working in the coal sector. If we are going to transition out of coal, what do we do about these communities people that are working in the sector? We do believe, from an AUD and NEPAD perspective, the work that we have been doing with some member states in preparing action plans for member states is, first, we really need to identify where are these jobs going to come from? Where are the sectors? So if we look at the indices, the national determined contribution for most member states, they do identify the sectors that are contributing to emissions, but also potential for solutions in terms of jobs. So if we do a skills audit, first identifying the sectors and do a skills audit, then we can start saying where we can have the potential to create jobs.
Where do you think is that?
In the African continent, for sure, the food, agriculture and food system sector is a key one.
Food system.
Yes. Egypt has this important approach of the nexus between food, energy, and water. It's an excellent nexus because it gives us very practical way, and we want to approach this question in a practical manner, not theory. Mm-hmm. Because, as I said, the needs are already there. Young people do not have jobs, and we want to transition them. Mm-hmm. We want to create jobs. If you look at that nexus, through the implementation of the NEPAD program, the Rural Futures program, Kinshasa Declaration is calling for us to look at practical means to create jobs. We went to Luxor the other day and visited a very important program in Egypt where they were consolidating farmers, and through that farmer consolidation, they were providing irrigation using solar panels. I saw that in Cameroon and other countries. Now, the other thing that I saw that I found very disturbing, we had solar panels lighting the streets, but these panels now, they break down and they cannot be repaired. Why can't we create opportunities in terms of training for young people to go into the sector? We're not only going to be importing these panels, produce them here in the continent. Train them to repair them. These are opportunities to develop entrepreneurship for young people, but also for those who might be losing out for the existing jobs that they do have.
So what do you think is missing not to run those programs, of training and getting the labor market and talents ready to take jobs, as you mentioned?
I think there are a couple of issues. The first one, we need to get more intermediate-sectoral coordination at the national level. This is our observation. So we go into the countries and you have a lot of good things happening. The Ministry of Education is doing something, the Ministry of Labor is doing something, the Ministry of Employment is doing something, but they're not talking to each other. So there is no central database to even see the capacity that is being built.
So that's on a national level?
That's the national level. We need to have strong national level focus.
Coordination.
We need to also have these institutions capacitated with infrastructure in terms of new technologies, that they can have highly skilled young people in the TVET sector. It's not all about going to university to get an engineering degree. We think we need to refocus our curriculum in education to look at vocational training and raise it up to have highly skilled technicians who can go into the sectors and take advantage of the opportunities that are there. Thirdly, information.
Yeah.
We
share
all-
information? You
yes.
think we share information enough?
We need to share information. We all sit here and we talk about the green transition and the jobs, and we pretend as if these young people know about these things. It's just a few of us sitting here in Cairo.
Do you
having
think
this
the
conversation.
education that we have now, the systems that we have in place now, are ready to prepare the next generation for a green economy jobs?
I think we can do better. I think the systems need to be improved. We need to have systems that have more information, open access information, use the technologies that can reach these young people so they can find out the opportunities that are there. And the last point I would like to mention is partnerships.
Yep.
Partnerships with the private sector, I think, will be a win-win situation, because the private sector coming into these countries are looking for opportunities for business, but they need the human resources to do the work. So if they have placements to bring young people, or even people who were working before, to learn the new skills that they need to transition their industry, then we will be making a huge difference.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, your thoughts? I saw you writing notes, so please.
Thank you very much, and it's a huge pleasure and honor actually to be here on such a distinguished panel, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak. A number of points that I would like to make in response very much to many of the interventions we've heard before. If we talk about a just transition, I think it's this challenge of this transition away from fossil fuel intensive industries such as coal, very often the energy sector, towards renewables, towards some green technologies in this sector. And we often hear a very simplified version, well, the miners can then work in renewables somewhere. If we just look at some of the global numbers here, according to the ILO, the green energy measures that are being taken create about 18 million jobs globally. However, at the same time, global warming results in 80 million job losses. So there's a huge gap. And I think we need to be aware that a just green transition has to go beyond the energy sector, has to encompass all sectors. And there are green jobs and green skill requirements across all sectors, from infrastructure to agribusiness to manufacturing to tourism even, etc. So I think the focus very much has to be much broader than it very often is. The second point I wanted to make, and it sort of comes back to our previous speaker in particular, is the role of the private sector in this context. I work for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We invest in majority of our investments in the private sector. And what we do in this context, and I think the role that we feel we can play, is combining green investments across a range of different sectors with a very strong focus on human capital development, on skill developments, on linking employers with vocational training providers, with universities, of actually looking at the challenges that employers very often face in recruiting people with the right skills, retaining people with the right skills, attracting talent, etc. And by addressing those challenges, we actually create routes into viable jobs for young people, for people whose skills are stranded because they're no longer needed, for women, for people in more remote regions, etc. So it's that important role, I think, that the private sector can play, and in this context, multilateral development banks such as EBRD, that I think is very important. And then in partnership, of course, with policymakers. So just to give you a very specific example, maybe, if I may, in Egypt, we're working on this new, very high-profile initiative that has been mentioned many, many times here in the past days, NWAFI, and one of the things that we do here is it's about decommissioning of gas-fired energy plants, electricity plants, and then looking at what can we do with people in that sector to better understand how can they be redeployed, how can they actually be retrained, upskilled, reskilled, and what are the opportunities in the region or in the local labor markets that can be used in order to create new livelihoods, new opportunities. And very importantly, what is the private sector able to do through access to entrepreneurship, access to skills, access to vocational trainings. And then linking that engagement that we have with the private sector to, for example, look at national skill standards so that young people coming out of education actually have the skills that are needed in the labor market today, that reflect the requirements of employers, and that they can verify what those skills are. Sector skills councils, which are industry-led bodies that engage with ministries for education, ministries for labor, but also sometimes sectoral ministries, in order to look at the human capital needs of the sector in that particular country. So there are specific policy engagements, I think, where the private sector also really can make a difference, and where organizations such as ours, in a way, act as a conduit in order to shape those solutions.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. So many challenges mentioned. Sharing information, I'm going to just mention some. Better education, technology, skilling the workers, training, giving workers fair opportunities, coordination, as she mentioned, on a national level. From a government point of view, what do you think the innovative approaches that should be considered by every government in addressing those challenges and this, I would say, a very critical climate promise?
Well, I think that part of the work that we are engaged in is to identify transition pathways for vulnerable sectors of our economy. And what the Just Transition Framework means for us is that as we work out how we would want to be introducing green technology to lower the carbon footprint of those sectors of the economy, we've also got to be immediately addressing the question of what kinds of people would you want to work in those industries. And as colleagues were talking, it strikes me that what we have to be conscious of is that we have two technological revolutions that are taking place at the moment. The first one is obviously the IT revolution, and or the fourth industrial revolution. The green technology revolution, in a sense, is the fifth industrial revolution, but it's happening parallel with the fourth industrial revolution. Now, I think that certainly in my own country, we have been focusing on for a long time on the issue of the STEM subjects, science, mathematics, biology, and so on. But what you are increasingly realizing is that you can't have a Chinese wall between those subjects and IT, artificial intelligence, robotics, because those technological changes are also happening in the green economy. So you would find that if, for example, in power stations you have electrical engineers, those electrical engineers may know a great deal about electricity, and it may be very simple to transition them from coal-fired generation to renewable generation. But what they don't know about is artificial intelligence that's actually going to run those plants in future. So I think that perhaps this reskilling exercise is complex in ways that we haven't thought about because of the parallel processes of technological change that are taking place.
Thank you. Ambassador Ahmed, you're writing notes. Please share with us.
Thank you, very rich interventions. Maybe 2-3 thoughts. First, I think it's very important and has come up that we cannot have green measures or green jobs, etc., in isolation from the broader socioeconomic landscape or transformation in the economy. And I think that is now agreed upon, and the interface, the interconnectedness of the responses and the measures across the economy, the labor market, etc., is something fundamental. So that is an important point that I'd like to highlight, and it also applies to ensuring that, for example, climate finance works for reconstruction, for development, for multiple purposes, and to bring those together. On the transformation and the impacts, again, we talk about IT, but again, the speaker on my right mentioned agriculture, which remains of fundamental importance in Africa, and I think it should be also an important priority when talking about a transition to a green economy. And then I was thinking about when we were also talking about the changes in the labor market and all of these, what we're witnessing. We didn't mention COVID, for example, and we see that the COVID pandemic had a huge impact that no one expected or saw on our work habits, on a lot of things on the labor market. So this is a very fast-moving landscape, and we're seeing a lot of unforeseen developments that add to climate impacts, that add to many other challenges at the same time, and we have to deal with them at the same time altogether.
Thank you. Amy, John Kerry yesterday in his opening remarks said no government can finance the transition to green economy and fight climate change on its own. So government don't have that money. And the bottom line, what we need is blended finance, partnership. You mentioned private sector. How important is to partner up all together in order to fight for zero agenda and create jobs along the way?
It's absolutely critical. We won't get there without partnerships between the private sector, the public sector, civil society, and frankly, informal communities. So one thing we actually haven't really touched upon is the number of workers across the continent who are working in informal economies. So it's not like we can just say, okay, you can go to that vocational school and learn those tools. It doesn't work that way, right? So we need to be realistic. Look at Egypt, for example, in the agricultural sector. Over 95% of the people who work in agriculture right now are in an informal job, an informal economy. And so if we don't use the economies in which they're working, if we don't use the private sector as a way to build this skills training, we're not going to get there. So one possibility is
how can we excite the private sector?
One possibility is we think about migration as a tool for development. Right? If we're not going to have formalized education where someone can go and learn how to repair a solar panel or whatever, but there is a need for the skills elsewhere in the world. Can we, through circular migration, actually build the knowledge transfer, the skills, the capacity that then enables people coming back to grow that capacity throughout Africa? That's key, because unless we sort of take into account the way things work in real life, we're not going to get there. And increasingly what we're seeing is that migration can be one very, very critical tool for development, and one, frankly, where the private sector is going to play an increasingly important role. I'll just say one more thing, which is that we know there's already a shortage of labor, a shortage of supply for people to do this kind of technical work in the green economy.
And this is what I keep hearing, by the way. We don't have enough. This is what I keep hearing from businessmen and different stakeholders. Every time I do an interview, they say we don't have talents.
We don't have it, it's true. So let's think about, how do we build apprenticeships? How do we bring people in? How do we actually, there are more than enough people. We have a growing youth population across Africa with people who are going to need the skills. So let's use the on-the-job training, yet let's use those opportunities in order to create the skills base looking forward into the future.
And on the other hand, our youth, they're all complaining about not finding jobs. So they leave the universities and they don't have jobs, and they stay at home doing literally nothing. Barbara.
Thank you very much. I think this discussion about the role of the private sector, I think is very critical in this context, because in the end, it is the private sector that is the engine for job creation. It's the engine for partly resolving this challenge. I think, as you said, the private sector, companies stand and fall with the quality of the people that they employ. And I think companies and management in companies is very well aware of that. What they very often struggle is finding people who have the right skills, particularly in very sort of specific technical areas that are maybe not very glamorous, you know, where you end up being in a blue-collar job. It doesn't sound that fantastic as a young person. But at the same time, these jobs can actually offer real career opportunities, but companies really very often fail to attract people. I have plenty of examples, but automotive is a classic example. We have huge companies that are our clients who cannot find people who want to work on the shop floor because it's not the glamorous thing to do, and they can actually earn the same if they work in a shopping mall stacking shelves. So what is the incentive for young people to take these jobs? And I think this is where we are working, but I think where policymakers are also, in a way, asked to work with employers to look at what are better progression routes, how can they be more involved in shaping curricula and training and education at vocational levels, making these careers more attractive, very importantly also creating permeability from vocational jobs into management. So you're not always stuck on the shop floor, but actually you can progress. So I think it's these opportunities, these better career paths that need to be created and then communicated and then promoted through networks, through mentorship, through role models, through engagement with schools, shaping education decisions that young people take at a very early stage. And it's that partnership to get the private sector into opportunities and at the right table, onto the stage and in the classrooms, in the conversations with communities, that needs to be facilitated. We do part of that, but I think a lot of other actors need to be participating in that as well.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to bring in Mr. Vivek, who has been listening patiently. Vivek, the IFC is doing a lot to push the agenda of climate change. Yesterday, I read the commitment done by the World Bank group, and it's fascinating. You're even increasing the commitment. Tell me more about how you support the green labor market transition.
Sure, thank you so much, and I apologize for not being there in person. I lived in Egypt for many years, and normally at any opportunity I'd love to come back, but in this case I couldn't. I just want to thank you all for putting this on the table, because unfortunately this aspect of the green transition has largely been ignored, not given importance. And as I keep saying, we may solve the climate problem, but we're going to have a social problem or a social challenge in our hands if we don't work on it in parallel. And what do I mean by that? I think, the minister spoke quite well about it, but let's just use some data points. I think one is the global energy industry employs about 2% of global labor. So that in itself, just looking at the energy sector, is important, but is not important enough there. We really need to start looking at the entire value chain. So if you look at the whole sector of coal, say in a country like India, the Indian Railways is a major revenue generator because of coal. They transport the coal. We have the entire logistics of the coal sector, for example. What's going to happen to the job losses as we are weaning from fossil fuels? I also want to share with you that in many ways, this is similar to what the minister just said, the digital revolution. The digital revolution net created new jobs, and I think that's what the green transition will do. There was a report launched in India 2 weeks ago by the Asia Society Policy Institute that said that if India transitioned to net zero by 2050 instead of 2070, it create 20 million new jobs as against 15. So a net increase of 5 million if you transition faster. Like the digital revolution, what is going to happen is new jobs are going to be created in some geographies and some sectors, and jobs will be lost in other geographies and other sectors. So that will be the big challenge, and how do we solve for that? So I think I'd like to break it up into two broad areas. One is how do we do upskilling or reskilling to people who are going to lose their jobs? And that is going to be hard because some of these people are, don't have an age bias on the wrong side of 50, but it's just much harder to reskill people after a certain age. So do we then make a decision, we're going to offer them some sort of a social benefit and let them retire, and how do we get new people? So really reskilling people to move away from their old jobs of managing a boiler to managing solar farm, or new sectors that are emerging like green buildings. If we are to achieve what we're talking about in green buildings, we will need a whole generation of green building experts who can go and audit these buildings and check whether they're meeting standards, helping with designs, et cetera, et cetera. You're very successfully just launched FA right now, 10 billion gigawatts of energy, 10 million gigawatts of energy. You're going to need a whole generation of engineers and technicians who can manage these solar farms. And like the minister said, AI will be used here. So that is one thing that we need to get at. But I think what is equally important is, are we looking at the medium to long term? What is our education system doing to produce a generation of young people who can then take up these new jobs? And that is a lot harder than because in many cases we don't even know where these new jobs will be created. We know they'll be in solar and green buildings and decarbonization of steel and cement. So some of these we know, but we really don't know a lot where, there will be new sectors coming up which we're not aware about. So what I really think is, and I know this is a bit sort of dramatic, but we really need to look at our education system as a whole. How do we train people to think a bit differently, think more creatively, and get them to adapt as they move along in their careers? Because we may train them for something today, but when they turn 35, that sector may be obsolete already. And then we need to have them upscale or reskill for something else. So I think it's really about looking at our education sector and as a whole, and the economic impact of the entire value chain when we look at greening the economy, and not just power in a few select sectors, because the impact is going to be felt throughout the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Estrine, how difficult or easy is it to, as he mentioned, to get our youth to think differently and to adapt to the new technology, think of green jobs? And what are green jobs to start with? I've spoken to so many here, and every time I say green jobs, they go, what? I'm being serious, so please.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think you already put your hand on the question, the very pertinent question. What are green jobs? So, because we are part of this discussion, we can talk about green jobs, but the ordinary young person out there really doesn't know what green job is. And so I think, for one, we have to start there, communication. information. So when we come back, go back to our capitals, our offices after these kinds of meetings, it's an obligation that we do have to take this discussion down to the level where the young people can understand what we are talking about. So as everyone have said here, I think when we start at the level of the countries, because I think the country system is very important. As you said, it's different from different countries. The sectors that can create these opportunities of green job. But green job, we are looking at jobs that are environmentally sustainable. Well, they're promoting environmental sustainability, but also, because we are talking about jobs, they can also provide a living wage for the young people. It's not about, just having any job. We want them to be able to get the job that they can live on. So there's a question, one, of information, communication, but also a question of mindset change. We talk about agriculture and food system, many young Africans that I've engaged with, including my own children, don't want to go into agriculture, right? Because they don't think it's for lack of a better word, sexy profession. And they don't also know, they're not aware that it's not about just the on-farm production, but getting involved in the value chain. I think this is the message that we have to be selling. And if you talk about the value chain, you're looking about production, you're looking about distribution, you're looking about transformation. And within this value chain, we can then look at the use of technologies that can make sure that we use, less, for instance, energy that are high in emission production. So we have to look at our curriculum at the national level. The kinds of skills that we are training our children is important. So education, curriculum revision, so that they take into consideration these kinds of things are important. I believe that part of that might also just be cataloging, the possible jobs that we are talking about. So if a young person is applying for school, university degree, they know what opportunities are there. But beyond formal education, as Amy was talking about, we also have an obligation to take it to the communities that we work with through our partners, whether they are NGOs who are playing incredible role with communities to build adaptation capacity. For instance, this is Africa. We are facing climate change. We need to adapt to these realities. What are the skills that we can bring to our communities, whether it's in climate, smart agriculture, and all the sectors that we are talking about. So collaboration with NGOs, collaboration with the UN agencies, collaboration with government entities. I think critical to this conversation is partnerships and collaboration to change information so that young people can be aware and making that information accessible to them so they know the opportunities that are there. And lastly, again, I don't think we can overemphasize the point of the private sector playing a critical role to support this transition. But that said, it's not only about young people being employed by big corporations. This is why the centrality of training is important, so they can employ themselves. If you look at big economies, SMEs are the drivers of these economies. This is what we want for Africa. We want to develop small and medium-sized enterprises so that these young people can be their own employers and have mentors to help them to get there. So from an African Union Development Agency perspective, we are pushing to develop capacity to design small and medium-sized businesses that these young people can be their own boss, because that's what they want. They don't want to work for any boss, especially now with COVID. I have people in my office, they will tell you, we don't want to come to the office 5 days a week. The whole job profile has changed. The employment profile has changed. And we have to move along with this change and give them the tools, that can help them to function in this new work space and be their own bosses or contribute to the economy, whether as an employee or an employer whatever capacity they want to
Very,
be.
very true. The
Yeah.
labor space is changing and in a way that we could have ever imagined. I have some time to do one round of closing notes. I'm going to start with you, Your Excellency. What is your message to the youth in your country and to the international community that will help overcome this challenge?
Well, I suppose the fundamental message is that as we enter into a green transition in developing countries, that transition has to help us with the underlying development challenges confronting our countries. Whether those development challenges relate to economic exclusion, unemployment, infrastructure investment, service delivery, we have to ensure that as we green the economy, we are also dealing with those fundamental development challenges. If we don't succeed in ensuring that there is justice for those who have historically faced economic exclusion, we're not going to manage to attract the kind of public support that we would want to attract for the transition. I think that one can find in many developed countries that there is support for environmental issues in their own right. But in developing countries, there will be support for green transitions if those transitions can help with the underlying development challenges. And that can only happen if there is an equal balance of risks and opportunities for those who have historically been excluded. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Ahmed.
Thank you. Before coming to my final remarks, I think a very important point I wish to make is that it's important to ground this conversation in African realities. And African realities are contrasted. If we talk about training, actually, I had an institution that does trainings. We organize 50 trainings per year. When COVID happened, we had to shift our trainings online. Okay, try to deliver an online training in parts of Africa. People don't have access to IT infrastructure. It's very expensive. We had to set up physical spaces in the recipient countries to carry out these trainings. That is the reality of some parts, at least, of Africa that we need to be conscious of. Okay, we train someone. We contact him after a while to further build on that. The person is gone, has moved to somewhere else, the staff retention, etc., the mobility. Okay, and then you have to start again from zero and empower these institutions. These are some of the realities we have to deal with. And it brings me again, then finally, to fully agree with what Your Excellency says. It is about this pathway for climate needs to be also embedded in development, in addressing our development challenges, our underlying circumstances of limited access to finance, limited access to technology. And this is, again, I think a very important priority of the COP presidency to put a stress on that, on a just transition for Africa, and on integrated responses, not doing something from climate or environment that is isolated from that. And just to add finally, in what interests us in particular, is also to embed it in addressing situations of countries who are coming out of conflict, who are many in Africa. And we're working on a COP presidency initiative to bring together this framework of climate with peace and addressing situations of post-conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to actually take the ambassador's comments and build on them. I think the key issue for us is that we need to stay people-focused. We need to meet people where they are, whether they are subsistence farmers, whether they're displaced people in post-conflict societies, whether they're women, young people, or people who have full access to education. We need to have comprehensive strategies that identify solutions for people at all levels of society. And one of the tools that I think is extremely effective is migration. right? We need to see migration. Yes, when migration is not well managed, it can become a real challenge, but it's also this incredible opportunity. And as we think about building skills, enabling a green focused workforce, ensuring that we have an adequate workforce to address the emerging labor needs globally, migration can be one of the factors that allows us to achieve those goals.
Thank you. Estherine.
Thank you. Well, I think we have to be, as the ambassador said, look at this question with realism, and also look at this as not a future problem, but one that we are dealing with right now. And that said, we will want to see that it's important really to have very strong country systems. One that is that takes an all-government approach. So it's not a sectoral thing where, departments work individually, but they work collectively and jointly to deliver on results. That will call for very strong planning and coordinated policy frameworks. So I think South Africa is showing a very good example. Kenya, a few countries in Africa are having those frameworks, but I think focusing on implementation of these frameworks will really help us to see that just transition. The second point is the one on the partnership again. I think the partnership has to be pragmatic. I think the partnerships have to be long-term engagement and not just short-term relationships. So when the private sector comes, they should not just come but looking at the profits that they can make in terms of investment, but how they can accompany the government to also meet its developmental goals and objectives. And lastly, information and access to information on what are these green jobs is important. And AUD and NEPAD really is very willing to collaborate with different partners, the UN agencies, the private sector, and the government, so that we build a system that can bring information and access to information to these young people, and very practical things. We can work together to develop job plans for each of the sectors that are priorities for the governments. We can do this job catalog so that young people can have them online and know what we are talking about. And we can do job fairs. These are very practical things. This is for universities, but even going down to the communities, we can have opportunities to engage with them through the work that we are doing in our respective program and projects. So collaboration and sharing of experiences through this type of platforms is important, because we learn what is working in other places, in the continent, out of the continent, that can inspire us to do better by our communities in terms of going through this just transition and making sure that while we are doing that, we are not leaving behind any African who is in need of a job. Because you need to have a job before you are looking for a better one. But if you are not employed, then you want any job. But we know that for the sustainability of the planet and for the future of our grandchildren and children, we want to get to that green and just transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin. Kevin is not with us, right? Okay. Barbara, go ahead. I was trying to bring him in just in case I think we lost him. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I think a lot has already been said that I don't need to repeat. I think it's about partnerships, it's about policy solutions, it's about bringing the private sector in. But I think probably the most important one is about people. It's about keeping the focus on people and also remaining accountable and honest here. I think, we always talk about greenwashing, pinkwashing, whatever. There is also just transition washing. And just because you invest in green technologies does not mean that those opportunities actually are within reach of the normal people on the ground. And I think we just need to remain aware of that and need to make sure that all the partners, all the stakeholders that are involved here keep that focus on what do we actually achieve on the ground, and does it have the desired effect? Are we moving the needle? Thank you.
Thank you. So Vivek is not with us, right?
No, I am actually. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
Vivek,
Yeah. So
stage is yours.
Thank you. So just, I want to make three quick points. Yes, we don't have a definition of what is a green job. I agree. I'm not denying that. But I think the youth of today have figured out that the future is going to be towards a greener economy. And the good news is that, at least in my job in climate today, I get a lot more CVs than I've ever got for people looking for jobs in this space. Yeah. A lot of universities, the good news, have transitioned and have added courses on climate. Now, these are largely for white-collar jobs, but what we need is how do we connect emerging market schools and get them to start courses on climate so that this is, again, spread across the world and just not limited to the global north there. Last, what we need is how do we set up and transform some of our existing schools which offer, sort of the blue-collar jobs or more the vocational training. And the good news is, I think the private sector did pick this up when we had a transformation and when we transitioned towards a digital economy. And I think I'm hoping the same thing will happen where vocational training schools catering to the jobs of tomorrow related to a green transition will happen. So I am not that pessimistic, honestly, because human beings are resilient and we managed to adapt in the past. We will need a lot of help from governments and multilaterals like ourselves. And I think the private sector will pick up upon that opportunity and start with these schools very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we wrap up, I would like to say a few words. I hope those discussions will bring us a step closer to creating a better world for our youth. Let's keep the discussion going. Let's work together because it's the only way that we will overcome any challenge. That's what history taught us. I thank each one of you for all the work you do to make that happen. And I thank you also for being here, making the time and sharing your experience and thoughts with us. Thank you very much.